Their gums turned black, and their legs became purple weights. They built a road of food across the frozen desert for an army that never came. Discover the hollow triumph and the terrifying descent of the Ross Sea Party. The ice groans like a dying giant beneath their boots. A gray twilight chokes the horizon. Captain Macintosh stares into the swirling white void. The wind is a jagged blade of frozen glass skinning his face alive. Beside him, Hayward stumbles. His breath is a frantic puff of silver mist. The sea ice beneath them is thin and treacherous. It ripples like dark skin over a cold throat. The smell of salt and old snow is suffocating. Suddenly, the world splits open. A sound like a cannon shot echoes across the Ross Sea. A black crack zippers between their feet. The ocean below is an inkwell of absolute zero. There is no scream, only a splash. Macintosh reaches out with fingers blackened by frost. His nails are cracked and bleeding. He grips the edge of a drifting floe. The water is 1,000 needles stabbing his heart. He smells the ozone of the coming gale. The blizzard descends in a wall of solid white. It erases the footprints. It erases the man. The ice plates grind together with the sound of breaking teeth. The darkness swallows the last spark of human warmth. Back at the shore, the others wait by a guttering blubber lamp. The air inside the hut is thick with the scent of soot and rotting gums. They stare at the door as the wood shudders under the storm. How did the heroes of the Empire become the ghosts of the ice? Why did they walk into a trap they saw coming for 1,000 miles? The wind howls the answer, but no one is left to hear it. The month of May in 1915 arrived with the scream of frozen air. The steamship Aurora sat huddled against the cliffs of Cape Evans. She was a frail skeleton of wood and iron anchored to the edge of the world. Inside the belly of the ship, the men felt a false sense of peace. They spoke of the mission ahead and the great southern road they would build. Then, the Antarctic night bared its teeth in a gale of madness. The wind hit the hull with the force of a falling mountain. Thick iron cables snapped like dry twigs in the dark. The ship groaned as the sea ice beneath her began to shatter into 1,000 jagged gray knives. 10 men stood on the barren shore watching the lights of their home slide into the mist. The Aurora was being dragged out to sea by the relentless grip of the pack ice. She vanished into the white wall of the storm. They stood motionless as the sound of the engines faded into the roar of the wind. Everything was gone. The extra clothes and the heavy tents were drifting toward the horizon. The medicine and the bulk of the food were vanishing. The realization settled over them like a shroud of lead. They were stranded on a continent that does not permit life. They possessed only the rags on their backs and a few boxes of supplies in a nearby hut. They were shadows in a land of ghosts. Captain Macintosh turned his face away from the empty bay. The mission remained, even if the ship was lost. They were the bridge for an expedition that did not know they were dying. The silence of the hut at Cape Evans was heavier than the storm outside. They sat in the flickering light of a single candle. The wood of the walls popped and cracked as the temperature plummeted toward -40 degrees. They looked at their thin boots and their light wool coats. They were equipped for a walk in the park, but they faced a march of death. The ice shelf stretched out before them like an infinite white desert. The ghost ship was gone, but the duty remained. They would have to scavenge for rags and burn seal blubber to survive. They would have to become beasts to cross the ice. The first step into the void was the hardest. The Antarctic night settled in for the long haul. It was a cold that did not just chill the skin. It froze the very concept of hope. They were now the forgotten players in a tragedy written in the stars. The decision was a heavy stone cast into a frozen lake. They had no proper sledges or windproof suits. Macintosh looked at the vast white void and gave the order to march. The duty to Shackleton was their only law. They scavenged for scraps in the old hut left by dead explorers. They used rusted needles to sew together rough sacks made of canvas and burlap. Their clothing was a patchwork of desperation. They were beggars on a journey of kings. Then, the dogs began to die. The cold was a cruel predator that hunted the weak. One by one, the animals collapsed in the snow. Their hearts simply stopped beating in the sub-zero silence. The howling faded into a terrifying hush. Without the dogs, the men became the beasts. They strapped the heavy leather harnesses across their own chests. They leaned forward until their faces almost touched the ice. They pulled the sledges with the slow rhythm of the damned. The weight was a physical enemy that crushed their spines. Every mile was paid for in blood and bone. The Ross ice shelf stretched forever like a white sheet over a grave. The horizon was a flat line of indifference. The first signs of the rot appeared in the month of October. Scurvy is a silent thief that steals a man from the inside out. Arnold Spencer Smith felt his gums soften and turn a sickly shade of purple. His teeth loosened in their sockets like pebbles in mud. Old scars from his childhood began to split open and bleed. The body was forgetting how to hold itself together. The cold was reclaiming the very atoms of their flesh. They wiped black soot from the blubber lamps onto their faces to prevent the glare of the sun. It made them look like demons rising from the ice. The frozen blood on the harness straps turned into a dark crust. They marched through a world where time had no meaning. The wind was a constant roar that scoured the skin from their cheeks. Their eyes were red pits of exhaustion. Yet, they continued to drag the wooden crates. They were building a road of food for an army that would never arrive. Every depot they laid was a monument to a ghost. Their joints creaked like the wood of a ship in a storm. The pain was a constant companion. The ice began to change under their feet as the summer sun refused to set. It became a slush of gray misery. They were walking skeletons draped in filthy wool. The duty was the only thing keeping them upright in the void. The long march back from the final depot became a crawl through the mouth of a frozen hell. The Ross ice shelf was no longer a road, but a predatory beast. It waited for them to stumble. Arnold Spencer Smith collapsed into the drifts as his legs finally betrayed him. He could no longer stand against the driving gale. His comrades looked at him through masks of ice and saw the shadow of the grave. The sensory horror of the march was absolute. Scurvy had turned their mouths into chambers of rot. Their gums were swollen and blackened. Their joints felt like they were filled with crushed glass and rusted iron. The smell inside the cramped tent was the scent of a dying hospital. It was the odor of unwashed bodies and the sweet stench of decaying flesh. They huddled together in the yellow light of a blubber lamp. They were forced to eat raw seal meat to keep the spark of life flickering. They chewed on rancid biscuits salvaged from a cache left 10 years before. Each swallow was a victory over the void. Their stomachs groaned. The mental strain was a heavy weight pressing behind their eyes. The white desert stretched to the horizon in every direction. There were no trees and no birds. There was only the sound of their own ragged breathing. Spencer Smith lay on the sledge like a piece of discarded luggage. He was wrapped in filthy furs as the others strained against the harnesses. His face was a pale mask of agony in the flickering twilight. His legs had turned a deep and bruised purple. The skin was tight and shiny with the pressure of internal bleeding. He stared at the gray sky with eyes that had already seen the end of the world. The wind scoured the tent with the sound of grinding teeth. It was a rhythmic screaming. That never stopped. They were lost in a white cathedral of ice, where the only god was the cold. Madness began to drift. They spoke in whispers to save their strength. Every word cost a calorie they did not have. They were no longer men, but ghosts of the empire. They were the walking dead in a land that hated life. The rot of the soul was deeper than the rot of the body. They felt the world forgetting them with every mile. They were dragging a dying man toward a hut that felt like a distant dream. The descent continued. The silence inside the tent was a heavy blanket of frost. Arnold Spencer Smith lay still under the weight of 47 days of suffering. His heart gave one final weak flutter, and then stopped forever in the dark. The survivors stood in the biting wind to bury him. They marked the lonely grave with a single bamboo pole. It stood like a skeletal finger pointing at the indifferent stars. The snow began to erase him before they even turned away. They finally reached the shelter of the Cape Evans hut. The wooden walls felt like a fortress against the white void, but the air inside was poisoned by a different kind of sickness. Cabin fever set in like a rot. Captain Mackintosh stared through the frosted glass at the frozen sea. He was a man driven by a madness born of guilt and isolation. He could no longer bear the sight of the same four walls and the same dying faces. Victor Hayward looked at the captain and saw a mirror of his own desperation. They decided to make a final run for the distant base at Cape Royds. The sea ice between the points was a shifting jigsaw of gray danger. The others begged them to stay until the ice was solid. The mountain of snow was a living enemy, but the ocean was a hungry throat. Mackintosh and Hayward ignored the warnings and walked out into the swirling gray mist. The storm descended with a roar of crushing ice. The horizon vanished in a wall of white needles. Back at the hut, the survivors listened to the wind and waited for a knock on the door that never came. 2 days later, the gale subsided into a mocking quiet. The search party walked out onto the fresh snow. They followed the trail of footprints until the white ground turned into the black water of an open lead. The footprints simply stopped at the edge of the abyss. There was no sign of a struggle, and no sound of a cry. The black water lay flat and still like a mirror. The mountain of ice had taken its payment. The men at the hut were now 7 mummies trapped in a wooden box. They stared at the empty bunks of their leaders. The mission was a ghost, and they were its terrified keepers. The Antarctic night grew even colder. They lived in a world of shadows and soot. The silence of the dead was louder than the wind. They waited for a ship that might never come. They were the forgotten souls at the very edge of the map. On the month of January in 1917 brought a sliver of hope to the frozen edge of the world. 7 men sat in the gloom of the Cape Evans hut. They looked like mummies wrapped in layers of filthy wool. The sound of a steam whistle tore through the frigid silence. It was a ghost from a past life calling to them from the bay. The Aurora had returned. Her hull was streaked with rust and battered by 1,000 ice floes. The survivors stumbled onto the shore with eyes that could no longer process the sun. They were gaunt and hollowed out by the hunger. Their skin was the color of old parchment, stained by years of soot and seal blubber. The rescuers looked at the men and saw walking corpses. The joy of the meeting was short-lived and bitter. The survivors asked of Shackleton and the great crossing they had sacrificed their lives to support. The news was a physical blow to their broken spirits. Shackleton, his ship Endurance, had been crushed by the ice thousands of miles away. The transcontinental expedition had never even begun. The depots they built were useless piles of crates. Every mile they had dragged those sledges was for nothing. Every tooth lost to scurvy, and every frostbitten toe was a payment for a mission that vanished into the void. The heroic effort was a hollow triumph of the spirit. They boarded the Aurora and felt the warmth of the engines vibrating through the deck. They looked back at the receding white shelf. 3 of their brothers remained behind. They were locked forever in the ice of the Ross Sea. Spencer Smith lay under his bamboo pole. Mackintosh and Hayward were dissolved into the salt of the deep. The Antarctic night was reclaiming their footprints. The snow was a white sheet covering the evidence of their agony. The ship turned north toward the world of the living. The survivors sat in silence as the ice blinked out of sight. They were the forgotten actors in a tragedy that the world would soon overlook in the shadow of war. The legacy of the Ross Sea Party is written in the silence of the ice huts. It is a story of duty without reward. It is the cold truth that nature does not care for the courage of men or the glory of empires. The white desert remains indifferent to the suffering of those who cross its spine. The mountains of ice do not remember the names. Only the wind continues to howl through the empty rooms, where ghosts once waited for a ship.